entire chapter in my book about barriers that I think pastors face, because I think this is one of the great hurdles that we need to get over, because I really do believe that God's greatest gift to the church is these high capacity volunteer leaders. And I think so many pastors are missing out on that blessing because they think they have to do everything themselves. And so I think getting over that hump is a really critical first step of saying, okay, I'm going to entrust more people with important ministries in the church. I know for us that there are these natural constraints that I think some pastors feel. Some of them feel because of their church community. Some of them feel because of their denomination, what they are and aren't allowed to give away. I know for us that we had to get over kind of a committee structure that had been part of our history for a long time. And when we finally realized that committee structure and having kind of a nominating committee that was deciding who could serve, and they were serving 2-year terms and then had to be reelected, and that whole structure was really kind of holding us back. And so we had to press through all the change management of kind of doing away with that committee structure and moving more to a team-based structure that would allow us a little bit to be a little bit more nimble when it comes to entrusting people with ministry. And so I think there are some natural systems that need to be really reconsidered in a lot of churches. I know another thing that plagues so many churches is just, over-programming, that churches can get so gummed up with lots of programs that have existed for a long period of time. And the problem that we found was not just that there wasn't really a clear pathway for spiritual growth for people, or so many options for people to choose from, but we really found that it depleted our volunteer pool. That we had some of our best volunteers that were serving in other ministries that really weren't at the level of importance that were going to really affect the whole church. And so we found that it limited our volunteer pool because we had people so spread out in so many different ministries. And so those are some natural barriers, I think. The chapter in my book deals a lot more with kind of the personal barriers that maybe some pastors feel when it comes to giving ministry away. And I mean, one of them, if I'm just going to be honest here, is pride and control. I think there's a lot of us, including myself, that really struggle with, nobody can quite do it like me, or, I'm afraid to give it away because I'm not sure it's going to get done the right way. And I think once we get over that hump of saying, no, God really has brought people to this church that can serve. And his goal for those people isn't just to sit out there and watch me do all the ministry and put some bucks in the plate so that I can keep doing my thing. The reason that they're there is really to contribute to the ministry. And I think, a lot of pastors need to push through, again, including myself, need to push through that pride barrier, that control barrier, and say, okay, I'm going to give some of this ministry away. So I just believe to my core that God knows how to make churches, and that when he establishes a local church and a local community, that there are no Lone Ranger pastors, that he's bringing the right people to the table. And I think, pastors can sometimes get really, down on themselves and really depressed about not having the right people. And I think, I remember Elijah in the Old Testament who, found himself, battling Ahab, and he hits this point where he says, I'm the only one. I am the only one left. And God comes to him. He says, no, there's 7,000 more like you. And I'm bringing Elijah or Elisha, to be by your side. And so, I think God solves those depression problems with other people that he brings to our side. And so my pushback to a pastor who says, I've got no one out there, is to say, find one, think about one. And if you can't even think of one, let me push back and say, maybe you haven't gotten curious enough. In other words, maybe you don't know your people like you should know your people. Because here's what I know. As soon as I get curious about people and their background and what they've come through, and most of the adults in my church have been gainfully employed at some point in their life. Most of them, in fact, a lot of them even had leadership roles over other people in their workplace. And so the more I get curious, the more I realize that God has brought a unique set of skills and gifts in this person that they might contribute to the church. So maybe the answer is to get more curious. Maybe the answer is to get more creative. What a lot of pastors can do is kind of pigeonhole the idea of, like, I need this position. I need a youth pastor. And if I don't get a youth, or if I don't get a worship pastor, we're going to be stalled until I get that role filled. And I would just push and say, maybe get more creative. Maybe there's a person out there who can contribute something that would take load off of your plate in a different way, so that you could address those other critical needs in a different way. And so maybe there's somebody out there that could help you research your sermons, or help you with visitation, or help you with some of your counseling needs, or whatever that may be, that would free up a few hours of your week that you could concentrate on coming up with some other solutions in those other areas. And so I think of just one. You don't have to build an entire ministry, but maybe there's one person out there that God has brought by your side. And if you can't think of one, maybe get more curious, or maybe get more creative. So usually people think about the roles in the church, and as it relates to volunteer leaders, in three ways that kind of hold them back. They'll say that role is too big for a volunteer. They'll say that role is too important for a volunteer. They'll say the role is too pastoral for a volunteer. Like, you can't get your mind around a volunteer doing that particular role. And I would just say, I think we have to expand our mind. And I think there are certain constraints for certain pastors, again, either from their church or from their denomination, that says this can only be done by a pastor. But I think we have to be very, very diligent about parsing out, what are those actual constraints and what are some of the self-made constraints. Like, I don't want to volunteer in that role just because I don't want that person in the role. And I think we have to wrestle with that ourselves. And so let me talk about the three areas: too big, too important, too pastoral. For those who say maybe the role is too big for a volunteer, this is one that I would just totally push back against and say, I just haven't found that there is such a thing. I believe that if we will ask people and invite people in at a high capacity level, that people will step up. And so, I use the illustration that, we had at one point, one of our locations, we're a multi-site church, one of our locations had 900 people attending, and it had a staff of about 20 people. Everyone on that staff, except for one part-time worship leader, was a high-capacity volunteer. They were not paid. And the site pastor who was leading that site of 900 people and 20 staff was also a high-capacity volunteer. So I just haven't found a role that is too big, for a volunteer to step into. The second pushback is that it's too important, for a volunteer to step into. And so I think about categories like preaching. Maybe a pastor says, hey, that preaching thing is just too important to entrust to a volunteer. Or another area is finances. And part of the motivation is we want to maintain some control. We want to maintain some accountability for those roles. And we think that paying somebody is the best provider of accountability. And I would just suggest, I think there's other means of accountability even in those kind of roles, that, we've had a solid parade of people who are, who are lay people who are preaching at our church, whether they're high school teachers or stay-at-home moms or whatever, that we've just entrusted, but we've built a system of accountability around that, so that they don't feel like they're on their own out there. And there's lots of feedback and lots of help during the preparation process. And I think it's in terms of finances. I mean, we've had our financial systems, even as a pretty big church, led by a volunteer for a long, long time. And there's other accountability that you can bring around that, end of the year audits and other kind of things that maintain accountability around those important roles. And so, some would say it's too big, some would say it's too important. The other one is it's too pastoral for a volunteer. And again, I do realize that there are certain constraints and certain traditions. The Catholic tradition, for example, the priest has to be the one kind of overseeing the Mass or overseeing the communion portion of things. And there are churches that have high, expectations on their pastors for certain things. So you think about, communion, or you think about baptizing people, or you think about even visitation, hospital visitation or something like that, where you will hear the steady refrain from your congregation of, I just want my pastor to baptize me, or I just want my pastor to show up and pray for me while I'm in the hospital. And this is very much a cultural shift in a lot of churches. And again, I would say if you're willing to kind of fight the fight to press through this, because the more people see the body at work, the more people see, somebody's small group leader baptizing them, or somebody's, ministry leader visiting them in the hospital, the more I really believe that the church begins to feel empowered as the body of Christ to do some of those roles that historically have only been reserved for pastors. Gabe Lyons, in his book Next Christians, talked about these 7 sectors of influence in our society. And that when you see movements that get all 7 of these sectors working together, they actually together have the power to change the world, to change a whole society, to change a whole community. And he lists those 7 sectors as these. He talks about business and government and media and church and arts and entertainment and education and the social sector. And one of the examples of this is just how much the LGBTQ community has changed the landscape of our country. Again, you may, for good or bad, the sweeping change that 25 years ago, what our society thought about that issue compared to today is radically different. And it was because of a concerted effort in getting all of these 7 sectors working together to bring change. And the aha moment when I was wrestling with this study or this idea is the fact that Lyons said, one of the things about the church is that the church is the only one of those 7 sectors where people from the other 6 sectors are gathering every week. And so in a way, it puts the church in the driver's seat in our ability to enact change in our communities. And that's just always stuck with me. And so I believe that part of this understanding of high capacity volunteer leaders is seeing those leaders in their workplaces, in our communities, and saying, man, what if we could, work together, to leverage kind of kingdom values in our communities. And so I wouldn't say there's one sector that's more important than another. I would just encourage pastors to think through that lens and to consider, like, who's out there in the education space, who's out there in the business space that may be part of my church, that I could get 1 or 2 of those people together and, first of all, just inspire them to think about their work through a kingdom mindset. But secondly is to say, just how could the church engage with these things? Like, what would our community look like if the church and our education space were working together, or our church and our education space and our political or governmental space were working together? What would it look like if the church and the social space and the media space kind of work together on a project? So I think it's just a different lens to look through when we think about encouraging and supporting and unleashing high capacity volunteers in our communities.